Welcome to Dark Feed, where once you find the feed, it finds you. They say your instincts know before you do, that something deep in your gut starts screaming when things begin to slip. But even then, even when the alarms are going off inside your chest, you don't always listen. Because the people we love, they seem invincible, until they're not. This is the story of Bryce David Laspisa, a 19-year-old graphic design student with red hair, a soft voice, and a future most kids only dream about. It was August of 2013, the end of summer. He had just started his sophomore year at Sierra College in Rocklin, California, and on the surface, everything looked normal. New classes, a girlfriend he loved, roommates who described him as quiet but funny. He was close to his parents, called them regularly. No signs of trouble, but something shifted. It started subtly, a change in demeanor, a restlessness in his tone. He told friends he wasn't feeling like himself. He started giving things away, his Xbox, a pair of diamond earrings his mother had given him. Little signs that most people wouldn't notice, but when you line them up, they look like breadcrumbs. August 27, 2013. Bryce sent a text to his girlfriend Kim, saying he had something important to talk about, something she wouldn't understand. When she asked what it was, he just told her he loved her. She was concerned. He'd been acting off for days, staying up late, drinking more than usual. He'd started taking Vyvanse, a prescription stimulant, and mixing it with alcohol. His behavior had become erratic. That night, she asked him to come over so they could talk. She lived a few hours south in Chico. He said he would, and then he started driving. But what should have been a few hours on the highway turned into something else. Something strange. Something broken. Because Bryce didn't go straight to Kim's. Instead, he drove past her exit. Hours passed. She called him. No answer. When she finally got through, he was vague. Said he just needed to think. That he was fine. But he didn't sound fine. And then he vanished from the call. At the same time, Bryce's parents, Karen and Michael, were trying to get in touch. They lived down in Laguna Niguel, Orange County, several hundred miles away. Karen called her son multiple times. No response. Eventually, in the early hours of August 28th, her phone rang. It was Bryce. He said he was in Buttonwillow. That's a tiny town in the Central Valley. A dusty patch of land off the I-5 with almost nothing in it. A gas station, a truck stop, a few empty roads and flat fields that stretch into silence. Karen asked why he was there. He didn't explain. He just said he was pulling over to sleep. She thought that was smart. It was the middle of the night. He sounded tired. Maybe all he needed was rest. She told him to call in the morning. He said he would. Then the line went dead. But morning came, and no call. Karen tried again. Nothing. She called the local CHP, California Highway Patrol, and asked them to check the area. They sent an officer out to the Buttonwillow rest stop. And there they found him. Bryce was sitting in his car, alone, awake. The officer said he seemed coherent, calm. No drugs or alcohol in sight. He said he was just blowing off steam, that he was on his way to see his family. The officer asked if he needed help. He said no. They let him go. But here's where things get even stranger. Because even after that interaction, Bryce didn't move. He stayed in Buttonwillow for hours. 7 hours to be exact. A man who ran the local Castro tire and gas station, a guy named Christian, said Bryce came by more than once during that day. Each time he seemed spacey, staring, like he was waiting for something or someone, but couldn't say what. At one point, Bryce asked Christian to fill up his gas tank. He paid for it with his parents' credit card. Christian later said Bryce seemed nice, but something about him was off. He wasn't high, wasn't drunk, just distant. By this point, Karen was frantic. She was in touch with Christian, who tried to convince Bryce to call his mom. Eventually, he did. When Karen picked up, She was relieved, but also confused. Why had he been sitting in the same place for so long? Why didn't he come home? He didn't explain. He just said he'd be on the road soon. That was around 3 p.m. on August 28th. Karen and Michael went to bed that night expecting their son to walk through the door by morning. They never saw him again. Sometime in the early morning hours of August 29th, Bryce's 2003 Toyota Highlander was found smashed at the bottom of a 25-foot embankment near Castaic Lake, just north of Los Angeles. The car was upside down. The back window had been kicked out from the inside. Inside the car were his laptop, his phone, and his wallet. But Bryce was gone. No blood, no broken glass, no sign of struggle, just gone. And here's the part that will haunt you. At 2:15 a.m., just 2 hours before the crash, a video surveillance camera captured footage of Bryce's car driving up the access road near the lake. Then, at 4:29 a.m., the same camera showed the car again, in the same place, as if Bryce had driven up the hill, waited 2 hours, and then came back down. When the police investigated the scene, they determined that the car had gone down the hill at high speed, as if the driver had accelerated intentionally. But there was no body. Search teams scoured the lake.
Drone, divers, sans dogs.
Nothing. They checked nearby trails, canvassed neighborhoods. No one saw anything. No security footage. No tire tracks. Just the wrecked car, sitting like a tomb at the bottom of the slope. And the haunting silence that followed. Bryce Laspisa had evaporated, and no one could say how. Back home, his parents tried to make sense of it. They begged for information, held press conferences, shared his face on social media. But the more they asked, the fewer answers came. People started filling in the blanks. Some believed he had taken his own life, that the drive off the embankment was a final act, but that his body had somehow slipped into the lake and gotten trapped below. But that didn't explain the lack of physical evidence. No body, no blood, not even footprints leading away from the crash. Others believed he had walked away, that he had staged the crash, that he had planned to disappear all along. But why leave your phone? Your wallet? Why call your mom hours before? And if he had planned to vanish, where did he go? It's been over a decade now. There have been sightings, people claiming to have seen him hitchhiking, working in a warehouse, living off the grid in Oregon. None confirmed. Every few months, a new rumor surfaces. A trucker thinks he saw someone fitting Bryce's description. A homeless man in Sacramento looks like him. But every lead ends the same way, with more questions. The last confirmed sighting of Bryce Laspisa was on that security camera. Alone, in his car, at the top of the access road, watching the darkness. And whatever happened next, whatever made him drive down that hill, is locked inside a silence no one has been able to break. Bryce's parents still wait for answers. They keep his room the way it was. They light candles. They've never given up hope. Because until you find a body, there's always hope. But hope is a strange thing. Keeps you going, even when everything else tells you to stop. The moment the Toyota Highlander was discovered overturned near Castaic Lake, it was clear something didn't add up. The vehicle sat like a hushed monument at the base of a steep hill, twisted, battered, but intact enough to raise questions. The back window had been kicked out from the inside. Bryce's phone and laptop were still inside. His wallet sat untouched. There were no drag marks, no blood, no footprints leading away. But Bryce Laspisa was gone. It was 5:30 a.m. on August 29, 2013, when a CHP officer spotted the wreck. The car had clearly crashed hours earlier, but there was no sign of the driver.
No witnesses.
No calls to emergency services. Nothing. From the moment the authorities stepped onto that hill, the timeline began to crack. To understand just how strange it was, you need to rewind the clock. The day before, Bryce had spent over 24 hours slowly winding his way down the California freeway system. He had left Rockland on the 27th, claimed he was headed to his girlfriend's place in Chico, then pivoted and drove far south, eventually ending up in Buttonwillow, more than 350 miles from where he started. And once he arrived there, he sat. He parked at a rest stop and remained there for nearly 13 hours. It's one of the most bizarre elements in the case. He was in no rush. He wasn't asleep. He wasn't lost. He just waited. At 11 a.m. on the 28th, he called roadside assistance to fill his gas tank. At 3 p.m., he told his mother he'd be leaving soon. At 5:30 p.m., the same roadside assistance driver saw him again, still in the exact same spot. This wasn't typical behavior. Bryce wasn't known for indecision. He was methodical, focused, but something had shifted. Something inside him was slowing things down, making the road ahead impossible to step into. Just after midnight on August 29th, he finally pulled away from Buttonwillow and continued his journey. It should have taken him less than 3 hours to reach his parents' home in Laguna Niguel, but he never arrived. Instead, around 2:15 a.m., surveillance cameras from the Castaic Lake area captured Bryce's car heading up Lake Hughes Road toward the recreation area. 2 hours later, at 4:29 a.m., the same camera caught him again, driving up that road a second time. It suggested something chilling. That Bryce had made it to the top, waited for 2 hours, and then circled back to the same point. But he wasn't going home. He wasn't calling for help. He was stuck in some kind of loop. Psychologists might call this perseveration, repeating the same action again and again, often due to emotional distress, psychosis, or neurological disturbance. It's not uncommon in people suffering mental breaks or drug-induced states. But no one had reported Bryce using anything that would cause hallucinations or delusions. No one had seen him violent. He passed a wellness check from Highway Patrol the day before. And yet, the footage painted a picture of a young man trapped in his own spiraling headspace, circling an unseen answer. And then came the crash. Sometime between 4:30 and 5:30 a.m., the Toyota Highlander accelerated down a steep service road and launched off an embankment. Investigators estimated the car was traveling at around 40 to 50 miles per hour when it left the edge. It hit the slope, tumbled, flipped, and landed on its roof at the base of the hill. The damage was serious but not catastrophic. The airbags had deployed. The rear window was shattered outward, not inward, meaning someone had kicked it from the inside to escape. That someone was presumably Bryce. But there was no blood, no footprints, no dragging signs, no trace of injury, and no sign of where he went next. Search teams were on the ground by sunrise. Helicopters scanned the area. Dive teams entered the nearby lake. Scent dogs followed trails into the brush, but each one went cold. It was as if Bryce had vanished mid-step. The theories began immediately. One of the most common was that he had suffered a traumatic brain injury during the crash. A head wound, internal bleeding, something that had disoriented him and caused him to wander off into the wilderness. But that didn't explain the lack of blood, nor did it explain why his wallet, phone, and laptop, the three things someone might need if they were trying to disappear, were all left in the car. Another theory emerged, that Bryce had staged the crash, that he wanted to vanish, to escape some inner torment, and the crash was a performance, a way to throw everyone off the scent. But that required a leap. Staging a crash like that, one that would fool investigators and search teams, isn't easy. You'd need to plan, you'd need to act, and above all, you'd need to leave nothing behind. Yet Bryce left everything. He didn't even bring water, and the area around Castaic Lake is dry, desolate, dangerous terrain for someone on foot. Investigators brought in cadaver dogs. No hits. They brought in drones. Nothing. Then came the helicopters with heat-seeking sensors. Still nothing. It was like the earth swallowed him. Bryce's parents clung to the hope that he'd lost his memory, that maybe he had experienced a fugue state, a form of dissociative amnesia triggered by extreme stress. In that scenario, he could have wandered into a nearby town, assumed a new name, and started over without even knowing why. It had happened before in other cases, but it didn't explain the silence. No bank account activity, no social security usage, no hospital records. It was like he had been erased. That didn't stop the sightings. In the weeks and months that followed, dozens of tips came in. People across California and neighboring states reported seeing a young man with red hair, sometimes dazed, sometimes lucid, sometimes silent. One trucker claimed to have picked up a hitchhiker near Bakersfield who matched Bryce's description exactly. The man refused to give his name. He had no ID. He said he was heading south. Another person swore they saw him in a Sacramento park, sleeping on a bench. But none of the sightings were confirmed. Every lead hit a wall. His family hired a private investigator. They retraced his steps, interviewed the gas station owner, dug through phone records. They even obtained cell tower data from Bryce's last calls, hoping to triangulate his final location. The data showed something strange. Between Buttonwillow and Castaic, Bryce's phone had pinged off towers in a meandering, inconsistent pattern. He wasn't driving directly. He was taking odd turns, long pauses. It was as if he was stalling, or lost, or being followed. That's when the paranoia started to creep in. Some theorized he wasn't alone, that maybe someone else had been in the car, that maybe he'd picked up a hitchhiker, or worse, someone had been following him since Buttonwillow. But there was no evidence.
No fingerprints.
No tire tracks but his own. And yet, the behavior didn't fit. Even if Bryce had planned to disappear, why stop for so long? Why call his parents? Why use his own credit card? Why not lie? Why make the trail so easy to follow, then vanish? There was also his behavior the week before. Friends noted he was using Vyvanse, a stimulant meant to treat ADHD, though he had no prescription. He'd been mixing it with alcohol, staying up for days. Vyvanse in high doses can cause paranoia, disorganized thinking, hallucinations, but it usually takes time or a serious overdose. Bryce's roommate said he'd been acting strange, but not dangerous. Kim, his girlfriend, said he was pulling away emotionally, that he'd said cryptic things, like he wanted to talk, but couldn't. It was as if something was eating him from the inside. One of the final calls Bryce made before the crash was to his mother. It was short, just a few words. He said he was fine, that he'd be home soon, but his voice was flat, distant, like someone repeating a phrase they'd memorized. Then the call cut out. In the years that followed, theories have multiplied like shadows. Some believe he died of exposure after the crash, that he wandered into the brush, collapsed, and was never found. Others believe he jumped into the lake. But dive teams found nothing. Some think he hitched a ride and started a new life. There are even those who believe he was picked up, abducted, and never had a chance to call for help. But each theory ends the same way, with a hole, an empty space. Bryce's parents continue to search. They hold on to hope. Every few years, they reissue missing person posters, update age-progressed photos, and plead with the public. But the trail is as cold as the night he vanished. And the more you study the case, the more one truth becomes clear. It's not just that Bryce disappeared. It's that he unraveled. Slowly, quietly, in real time. The drive from Rockland to Laguna Niguel should have taken 7 hours. Bryce was on the road for nearly 30. And in that time, he seemed to drift further and further from himself. By the time he reached Castaic, he wasn't the same person. And whatever he was running from or toward, no one ever saw it coming. There's a moment in every unsolved case where the search begins to change, where the focus shifts from the physical, from finding the missing person, to something else, something colder. You go from believing they're out there to just wanting to know where they stopped being. For the Laspisa family, that moment has come 100 times. Each time a body is found in a field. Each time a jawbone washes up in a river. Each time a news report flashes the words unidentified male. They hold their breath. They prepare themselves for an answer they don't want. And then the DNA comes back. Not Bryce. Over the years, the media faded. The reporters stopped calling. But the case never left. Not for Karen and Michael. They kept pushing, kept hiring private investigators, kept reprinting posters. Every year, they launched a new wave of awareness. Facebook campaigns, missing person registries, even reaching out to psychics when logic and science failed. Desperation took over. And still, nothing. Every few months, new tips would come in. A man in Washington state swore he spoke to a red-haired drifter who matched Bryce's description exactly. Another in Arizona claimed he'd seen a man fitting Bryce's profile sleeping behind a diner, mumbling to himself in fragmented sentences. A truck driver in Oregon said he picked up a hitchhiker who called himself Bruce, looked dazed, and seemed afraid to be recognized. None of them led anywhere. Flyers were posted at homeless shelters. Emergency rooms were put on alert. Progression images were circulated online. But time, as it always does, eroded the urgency. And in that silence, theories began to harden into myths. Some say Bryce had a psychotic break. That vivance, combined with exhaustion and alcohol, triggered a spiral into madness. That he wasn't himself during those final days. That he wasn't capable of making rational decisions. It's supported by the timeline. The hours spent sitting motionless in Buttonwillow. The aimless driving. The odd phone calls. The emotional detachment. People who knew him described a mental fog. A blankness behind the eyes. He was present, but only partially. Like something was hovering over his shoulder, feeding him thoughts from a place no one else could see. If that's true, if he suffered a psychotic episode, then maybe he wandered off in confusion. Maybe he collapsed somewhere in the wilderness. His body missed during the frantic early searches. That's what many law enforcement officers now quietly believe. But there's another theory, one that lingers in online forums and whispered speculation. That Bryce wasn't alone in that car. That someone else was with him in Buttonwillow. That someone was waiting in the shadows. A hitchhiker, a stranger, or someone from school. That maybe, just maybe, Bryce didn't vanish willingly. That he was forced out of sight. The lack of evidence cuts both ways. No sign of Bryce, but also no sign of anyone else. No fingerprints. No DNA. Just emptiness. But emptiness leaves room for horror. And in that void, darker theories grow. Some believe Bryce joined a cult, that he'd become disillusioned with life, with school, with relationships, and had sought something radical. Sounds absurd until you dig into his final weeks. The cryptic messages, the emotional withdrawal, the gifts he was giving away. It all reads like someone preparing to shed their former self. Others believe he faked his own death, that he wanted to vanish, to escape the weight of expectation. That he rolled his car down the hill, kicked out the back window, and ran. If that's true, then Bryce is alive today, living under a different name, working off the grid, watching the world forget him. But here's the hardest part. People don't just disappear. Not completely. The world is covered in surveillance. Cities are mapped. Banks track money. Phones track movement. The idea that someone could truly vanish in 2013, leaving no digital footprint, no paper trail, seems almost impossible. Almost. There's always the chance he died that night. That the crash disoriented him. That he wandered into the canyons surrounding Castaic and fell. That he lies out there still, bones bleached by the sun, hidden in a crevice no one has thought to look in. The search grid around the lake was wide. But it wasn't infinite. He could be 50 yards off a trail, buried in brush. That's the theory that haunts his mother most. That he's close. That they almost found him, but missed. That one more step in the right direction could have changed everything. Then there's the theory no one wants to say out loud. That Bryce didn't vanish because of psychosis or accident or escape. That someone found him after the crash. That someone hurt him. There's no proof of that. But there's no proof against it either. The hour between 4:30 and 5:30 a.m. remains a hole in the timeline. A dark, unaccounted for space where anything could have happened. A random passerby, predator, a moment of vulnerability, and silence. So much silence. That's what sticks. That's what keeps people awake at night. The fact that in the age of constant noise, Bryce Laspisa disappeared into absolute stillness. There were no calls after the crash.
No texts.
No sightings at gas stations or truck stops.
No CCTV footage.
Just a vanishing point. A young man standing at the edge of a decision so final, no one could follow him through it. Some people are convinced he's alive. Some are convinced he's dead. But the truth might never be known. And in that space between certainty and speculation, the Laspisa family lives every day. They visit the crash site. They light candles on anniversaries. They dream of him, not the Bryce who vanished, but the one who came before. The boy with the red hair, the soft voice, the artistic eye. The one who sent, "I love you," texts at 2 a.m. The one who called just to check in. That Bryce is frozen in time, forever 19. But the world moves on. New cases appear. New names replace the old. And slowly the urgency fades. The headlines stop. The public turns its eyes to the next mystery. But some of us remember. Some of us still wonder what happened on that hill. What Bryce saw before he stepped away. What decision he made in the final minutes, alone in the dark. And whether we've missed something obvious buried in the timeline. Because that's the worst part of all. The idea that he was trying to tell us. That every delayed drive, every phone call, every half answer and vague text was a coded message. A last attempt to say, "I'm not okay. Help me," before he couldn't say it anymore. Before the silence became permanent. Before he crossed into a place we can't reach. And maybe never will.